we are learning whilst we're doing all these things. So thank you for bearing with us. But looks like no major issues tonight, and still more people coming. Yeah. Okay. Okay, Miriam, you happy for me to start? Cool. Lovely. Hello, everyone. So glad to see all of you. So glad to have you all here. And quick apologies. We actually did have some confusion like an hour ago about the timing. But seems like we sorted that out, that most people who wanted to join are here now with us. So thank you so much for coming. My name is Christina Lunz, and I'm the co-founder of the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy. And I am so delighted to welcome you to tonight's event on a very important conversation around whiteness and feminist foreign policy. Very quickly, before I get into the content of tonight's event, some housekeeping, but Miriam mentioned it already. We kindly ask you, everyone, to mute yourselves, but we'd love to see your lovely faces if you're happy to have your camera on, because it's always like nicer feeling to see the people instead of like interacting with like a wall of black screens. We are recording this event tonight so that the people who can't make it now will be able to watch it on YouTube and on our website and everywhere later on. There will be the opportunity for you to submit questions after the initial conversation with the speakers. Please submit your questions in the chat function here, ideally directly to Miriam, who you're going to meet in a second properly. But you can also tweet them at us on our Twitter, and that is @FeministFP. It is generally so exciting we're having this conversation tonight, the conversation around whiteness and foreign policy and whiteness and feminist foreign policy. And tonight's event is the second event of a 2-event series. And yesterday we had the incredible honor to be joined by our advisory board member, Professor Chandra Mohanty, who was the reason for lots of massive fangirling on Twitter. That was beautiful to see, as well as by our longtime ally and brain behind the Foreign Policy Interrupted newsletter, Elmira Baisrali, and we were also joined by our friend and colleague Casey Robinson, and all was moderated by our latest and loveliest addition to the CFFP family, Miriam Müller. Miriam will also shortly take over from here and lead you through tonight's event. So yesterday's event was focusing on the very patriarchal and racist and imperial structures that the international political system is built on. And I highly recommend you watching it if you weren't able to join last night. It will be uploaded shortly on our YouTube website and our social media. And tonight's event will be on feminist foreign policy and white supremacy. So feminist foreign policy, as I guess many of you are aware, as a government policy was first implemented in 2014 when the then Swedish Foreign Minister Margot Wallström announced her country's feminist foreign policy. And soon after, in 2017, Canada announced its feminist international assistance policy, and the Canadian government is currently in the process of developing a white paper on feminist foreign policy with civil society. And in 2019, France announced their feminist diplomacy. And earlier this year, in January, Mexico announced a comprehensive feminist foreign policy, making it the first country in the global south to implement a feminist foreign policy. Still, much of the debate around feminist foreign policy has been initiated and led by white and global north institutions and governments. But because ultimately feminist foreign policy must be about tackling all sorts of inequalities within international relations, tonight's event will be about how we can do this and how we can avoid perpetuating the very problematic and patriarchal empirical structures that we see within like mainstream foreign policy in feminist foreign policy. And I and we, the team behind CFFP, could not be prouder to have two of the sharpest trailblazers for this topic with us tonight, and that is Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins and Toni Haastrup. And my colleague Miriam will introduce them in a second. Last but not least, it is also very important to note that we, the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, we are a white-led organization, and that the 3 women that have started building this organization are all white. We are very mindful that this kind of in a way is mirroring the very patriarchal, the very problematic patterns that we're trying to disrupt. And though we're trying our best to practice intersectional feminism, we still catch ourselves having our own white feminist moments constantly. Founding a non-profit organization from scratch as women with no resources in the back means being constantly in a state of financial insecurity and anxiety, underpayment, and too often self-exploitation. But as soon as we had the financial resources, we've genuinely been trying to make space and have other voices join the team and the organization and lead the conversations. I'm not saying that we're perfect at that, but we're trying, and I'm grateful we're learning tonight from this event. And now, without further ado, I'm very excited that Miriam is taking over now and is leading us through this event tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kristina, and thank you all for joining us today. So I will just quickly go into the structure, how we have planned this tonight's or this evening's event. So at first we will hear a keynote speech by Toni Haastrup, and then we will have a short round of questions. I will ask Bonnie Jenkins, and then we will open the floor. So like I said in the beginning, please send me your questions you'd like me to address. I will collect them and then ask them to our speakers. And also, if you want to, you can of course also ask questions to Kristina. So we have like 3 people you can address your questions to. And after the first round of questions, again, I will ask some questions to Bonnie, and then we will see how much questions are left. But we really want to emphasize this should be as interactive as possible via Zoom. So we are super interested in your questions. Also regarding that, in the end of this project, we will publish a policy brief. So we are really interested in the different aspects you think are super important and we should address. Maybe also shortly, why this topic now and why us as the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy. So I've joined the team most recently as a strategic policy and research advisor. And but I know the discussion about this topic has been going on for a while, also because I've been in touch with the whole team. And what we have noticed also is when we address that feminist foreign policy is so wide, it often ends then in a discussion about representation, which is also really super important. But then it ends like at diversity strategies or like empowering empowering other women, especially women from the global south, but not really seeing the agency and the knowledge that might have been marginalized by white feminists. So this is something we really want to talk about and to be as honest and radical as possible. And also what is super important for us is to talk about actual intersectionality and be aware of it, and also just checking also the privileges that are around in foreign policy. I mean, like Kristina said, we are a white-led organization. We are based in the global north. So there are a lot of things we have to be aware of and learn. So I'm super, super happy that we are now officially starting this conversation, also commit ourselves to it. So I'm going to introduce our 2 speakers. I'm so glad that we're having both of them here. So Toni Haastrup, she's a lecturer at Sterling University, and she's focusing on the women, peace and security agenda, but also in general on the security architecture of the African Union and the European Union. And she is also addressing racial hierarchies within the WPS agenda, but also in general in feminist foreign policy. Thank you so much for being here, Toni.
Thank you.
And then we have Bonnie Jenkins, which also has recently published with her organization, the Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Transformation organization. They have published a statement collected with different voices around from peace and security, but also in general from foreign policy. They've published a statement that people committed to fight against racism and racial hierarchies within this area. So also we are super, super excited, and thank you so much already for you both for contributing so much to this discussion and also being real role models for us. So yeah, I let you start, Toni. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And can everyone hear me? And thank you to the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy for inviting me. I'll try not to take too much of your time because I'm very excited to hear what Bonnie has to say and to listen to your thoughts on feminist foreign policy and race and gender. So taking my prompt from the webinar title, I wanted to explore a little bit how I understand the functioning of whiteness and its manifestation in racial hierarchies and the possibilities of feminist foreign policy. So George Yancey describes whiteness as a synergistic system of transversal relationships of privilege, norms, rights, modes of self-perception, and as well as perception of others, unquestioned presumptions, deceptions, beliefs, truths, behaviors, advantages, modes of comportment, and sites of power and hegemony that benefits white people individually and institutionally. So I think one of the things to highlight from that specific definition of whiteness is that it is talking more about a system rather than about individuals, although highlights the importance of individuals in implementing this system of whiteness. So thinking through this as being more or less intrinsic to the formation of the state system within which foreign policy currently exists, one in which foreign policy is there to promote a country's interests, and in doing so, because of the current architecture of the international system, tends to reify the status quo, and this includes the whiteness that I've just spoken about, or white privileges, which then tends to want an advantage over people of color. Now, one of the things that I find quite fascinating, and I must admit that this is not necessarily how I was trained, as someone who is trained in international relations in the global north. Although we talk very much about international relations, the most of both the discourse, the scholarship, and the literature on foreign policy or international relations, or foreign policy within international relations, is very much designed as if it's a Western phenomenon, which is ironic given that the majority of the international system as it exists is what we might consider who I call the majority world, that are often minoritized by the systems of foreign policy as it currently exists. So when I think of whiteness and foreign policy, I believe whiteness is born of a global ideas of white supremacy that was crystallized through colonization, but also post-colonization relations. And this is what characterizes the relationship between the North and the South, the global North and the global South. I should say that I do not believe that those are perfect descriptors of the two constructed regions that I'm talking about, but for our purposes, they are useful delineations, because the West is not anymore anyway. So at the beginning of this, I think Kristina mentioned the idea that a lot of us understand feminist foreign policy as something that Sweden's come up with in 2014. And arguably, this has now gone beyond Sweden. Certainly we see that in Mexico earlier this year, but also when we talk about countries like Canada and France, and indeed a lot of other countries that do not necessarily declare feminist foreign policy, but seem to have the same attributes or the same intentions as Sweden does, we can say that a feminist foreign policy is increasingly becoming, for lack of a better word, a thing in international relations. Now, with the exception of Mexico, all of the countries that I've mentioned, and indeed some of the other countries that, again, do not necessarily articulate their foreign policy as feminist, are countries in the global north. And I think that this matters, and this matters when we're thinking about the ways in which different foreign policy agenda, whether feminist or not, can potentially reify certain racial hierarchies. Because in focusing very much, when we sort of look at the content of a lot of this country's foreign policies, whether it's Canada, France, or Sweden, the focus of this feminist foreign policy tends to be countries in the global south. Now, when I was trained in foreign policy, the idea of foreign policy is that foreign policy is an approach of a particular country that is based on its, you can sort of say, domestic practices, its understanding of the world, its own norms projected outside, often as an approach to all other countries. So in the international system today, we have about 193 countries, which means, you know, although there will be specificities in how each country engages with the other, the idea of foreign policy should be one policy for all with specificities within it. Now, I do believe that Sweden aspires to this, but Canada and certainly France do not. And I do not think that it is an error or a slight that Canada focuses, Canadian feminist foreign policy is feminist international assistance, or that French feminist foreign policy is French diplomatic assistance. And I'll talk a bit about why later, why I think that this is important. I think overall, while the moves towards feminist foreign policy approaches that are informed by feminism, I think it's important, and I think that it is certainly a progressive direction within international relations. I think we need to be a bit more nuanced and reflective. We need to ask questions. Who is this foreign policy for? We're often so concerned about the actors. So we talk a lot about Sweden, we talk a lot about Canada or France, but oftentimes we do not ask questions about who the feminist foreign policy is enacted on, okay? So who are those countries who are supposed to be beneficiaries or recipients of feminist foreign policy? What does the practice of feminist foreign policy mean to them? What does it imply within their own systems? And part of why I think that this is doable is the ability of the dominant countries to ignore the racialized dimensions of the organizations of the international system itself. This lack of consideration of race and how racial hierarchies are reinforced within the practice of feminist foreign policy. And they underline the enduring blind spots within the field as a field of study, but also within the practice of international relations more broadly. I think feminist foreign policy should be understood as a dynamic relationship between the global north and the global south, where the technologies and practices that are situated as global, for example, the Women, Peace and Security agenda, are actually designed to work specifically for those countries in the global north. So in some of the work that I've done with Dr. Jamie Hagan at Queen's University in Belfast, we found that by virtue of the fact that a lot of the countries that enact the Women, Peace and Security agenda, often as the cornerstone of feminist foreign policy, there is a tendency in the language of policy to construct another as the necessary recipient of foreign policy. And othering, as has been established in the literature, but I also think is very much known even within policy circles, is a very colonial tool that determines a certain dominant self over a colonial other or an inferior other, even if this is not articulated as such, but it definitely does sip into the language of national action plans, for example, and the sort of policy frameworks that are drawn from national action plans. Beyond this, however, I think there are two issues that also sort of confirm this racial hierarchies in the different practices of feminist foreign policy. So I sort of think about, it as the inability to answer yes to a set of questions, two questions in particular. So the first question is, to what extent does a feminist foreign policy, the whole of the foreign policy of a particular country, to what extent does it actually reflect what is happening within the domestic sphere of that country? And I believe that this is important because traditional foreign policy analysis suggests to us that there is always a link between the domestic and the international, that the domestic norms and domestic beliefs and practices often inform the international. And we know that a lot of the countries that practice feminist foreign policy, to an extent, believe this. So if you sort of see the sort of justifications that Sweden has used for the construction of feminist foreign policy, even before it applies it to anybody externally, it's very much embedded within Sweden's history, within a discursive construction of itself as a gender equal society, or potentially a gender just society. But then we do have to ask the question, to what extent is that true? Does Sweden's image of itself, is it the same for every man and woman within Sweden? And here, of course, I am talking about those people who have been racialized and minoritized. So the second question is, does a country that practices feminist foreign policy actually support, does it engender rather positive feminist futures in the countries, in the recipient countries? And here we can look at France as another example. France is a country that has recently declared a feminist diplomatic policy. I will admit that I'm still very unclear as to what that means, but as somebody who is both African and studies Africa, I would argue very strongly that French foreign policies have indeed been very detrimental to women in the so-called Sahel. When we look again internally, I can ask about Canada. To what extent does is Canada a safe place for women of the First Nations, Metis or Inuit communities, for example? So I think that these are quite important questions that we need to ask because, again, the argument is that the domestic is linked to the international. I think that the dominant brand of feminist foreign policy certainly fails to consider very seriously the racialized histories of international relations, and in a way is able to elide responsibility by sort of inserting that feminist in front of it. I cannot think of any head of state or any administration that would not agree that gender equality is a good in of itself, but beyond gender equality, that gender justice, justice for marginalized communities, gendered marginalized communities is important. But to what extent do we actually see this happening amongst those countries that declare themselves as feminist and those who are aiming towards a more feminist-informed foreign policy? To my mind then, for feminist foreign policy to work or to be true to that name, feminist foreign policy must be invested in upending the current system within which foreign policy exists. There is no foreign policy to date that intends to do that, the Swedish one included. For feminist foreign policy to work, it must provide a transformative alternative to the current practices of foreign policy and must pay explicit attention to the work that race does in international relations. This is not new. The idea that we need to think about race in international relations is not new. And I know that in our current 2020, this has become a very prominent direction for both research and policy considerations. But I think it's important to highlight that this is not new. In considering race, countries can begin to then account for structural violence and the impact that even well-intentioned framings like feminist foreign policy have. In considering race and linking race to gender, but also thinking about other oppressive or other identities that are often oppressed or marginalized within the international system. So disabled people, people from LGBTQIA communities. We need to think about how things like the military interventions that are still happening impact on their lives, particularly in the global south. We need to think about the arms race and what impact that has. I've often been fascinated by the fact that Sweden is one of the top producers of guns and aims to enact this feminist foreign policy. Now, I think it is important to highlight that I do not think that the intention isn't there. I believe that the people who work within this arena are feminists and they do intend for a feminist foreign policy. What I'm trying to highlight is that there are constraints on the realization of what I would consider to be feminist because of the system within the current system within which they're functioning, one that does not consult or understand the impact of the structural violence of racism, one that seeks to continue reifying what I would consider to be racial hierarchies, where, you know, the Swedes or the Canadians are really helpful to the other in whether that's Africa, Asia, or so-called Middle East. So I think in my it's my biggest hope that another foreign policy is possible, that there might be a different way of doing foreign policy, but it can certainly not be the foreign policy that is led by states. It has to be people-led, and it has to be one that is invested in solidarity. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Toni. I think now we all know what kind of challenges we are facing when we talk about feminist foreign policy, but also what huge potential there is. And thank you again also for pointing out in the end that it should be people-led and not linked, to the state. So I'm already getting a lot of questions here in the chat. So I will hand over to Bonnie and start with the questions. Would like to ask you as an introduction, and then actually I will open the floor. So Bonnie, I mean, we heard now from Toni something about the theoretical framework of feminist foreign policy, but also what is actually happening in policy making and policy designing. So I would be super interested in a personal question to know, so when was the first time and where you have realized, oh my gosh, feminist foreign policy is so wide? So
Yes, hi. First of all, thanks for inviting me to this conversation. And it's very nice to be here with all of you that I see, and those of you who I cannot see as well. The topic of feminist foreign policy is one that I have been aware of for a long time, but only very recently, I would say in the last year and a half, have I been really brought into it a lot. And that's really because I've been very much involved with a colleague here in the US, Lyric Thompson, who is leading the US version of feminist foreign policy that we actually launched a couple of months ago. As a result of that, I started to get a lot more involved, a lot more interested. I really, really am interested in the work right now and learning also about some of the things that other countries have done. We've referenced Sweden, we've referenced Mexico already, how they have approached the issue of feminist foreign policy and the way in which they have done theirs. One of the things that, and it's interesting to hear the conversation about it, is understanding the way in which it has been adopted in other countries and the way in which it is very much seen as very white. I think that there's a lot of history in terms of movements that have been seen, like the white suffrage, the women's suffrage movement, which has been seen as a very white movement, but there have also been so many people of color who have been behind the scenes, who are very much a part of it, and not really being recognized for the role that they play. One of the things that that I will remark on is that, yes, I agree that it is very much a white led effort, which many of the activities are. Not, of course, recognizing some of the work that's been done behind the scenes or predominantly at the beginning. But we are starting, in the US, for example, just as a contrast, starting to work on this issue more on feminist foreign policy. And I saw that there was a question in the chat about that popped up. Some of the questions are popping up, as you can see, about the definition. And I would just like to read what the definition is that we have addressed. And I'd love to maybe hear a conversation about, from Toni about, the way in which she has seen Sweden's and Mexico's as well, and the US, and talk about how we have to make sure that it is intersectional and it does represent the different viewpoints and cultures that really make up feminist foreign policy. The one that we have adopted very recently is feminist foreign policy is the policy of a state that defines its interactions with other states as well as movements and other non-state actors in a manner that prioritizes peace, gender equality, and environmental integrity, enshrines, promotes, and projects the human rights of all, seeks to disrupt colonial, racist, patriarchal, and male-dominated power structures, and allocates significant resources, including research, to achieve that vision. Feminist foreign policy is coherent in its approach across all of its levers of influence, anchored by the exercise of those values at home, and co-created with feminist activists, groups and movements at home and abroad. And I think when we talk about intersectionality and making sure that our feminist foreign policy does represent different viewpoints and different cultures of all of women, I think that it's important to one of my goals, put it to say, is to be an integral part of the work that we're starting to do to make sure that all the things that Toni has really amazingly, thank you, Toni, that was a great start, has highlighted is in fact incorporated in this, because what you're saying is so true about foreign policy and the way in which it was developed. A lot of the work that my organization is doing is trying to increase the voices, the diverse voices in foreign policy, understanding that the structures and the culture in which it was established does not recognize those diverse voices. And that continues to be the way it is now. And so we have to find ways to actually make sure that our foreign policy is diverse, not only in terms of race, but also in terms of gender and the different backgrounds and culture of genders that are within the foreign policy and the feminist foreign policy movement. So I guess the long answer to a short question is that, I became more aware of it when I became much more engaged in it myself. And I think that we are going to be trying to, from the start, do what we can to make sure it is much more intersectional and of different types of women and cultures and backgrounds.
Thank you so much. I will directly start with the questions from the chat because there are so many. I really hope we can answer all of them and find solutions. There's a question for Toni. I will just read it from Ana Velasco. Toni, in your opinion, how does the Mexican new membership to the Club of Feminist Foreign Policy disrupt, challenge, validate, perhaps, the dynamic relationship between the global South and the global North that feminist foreign policy entails. So what is, so as far as I understand, so is the Mexican government, can it be seen like as a mediator or as a bridge?
Right. Okay. So I think one of the first things to say is that the Mexican feminist foreign policy is relatively new, and unfortunately, one of the other horrible things COVID has done, in addition to all the horrible things that COVID has done, is that it's been very difficult then to actually get a handle on, what does it actually mean to start practicing feminist foreign policy, because a lot of energy and resources have understandably and rightly been diverted to actually dealing with this pandemic. But from what I understand, does it disrupt? It disrupts in the sense that, in almost every meeting we go to now, we're very quick to say, oh, and by the way, Mexico is the first country in the global South to have a feminist foreign policy. And I think that that's a good thing. I think that that's a really good thing. But when I think about the Mexican feminist foreign policy, and also try to locate Mexico in the context of power, both in Latin America, but also more globally, I do have questions as to the extent to which Mexico's feminist foreign policy can be an impactful foreign policy. Despite those questions, however, I think one of the things that the Mexican feminist foreign policy does really well is that connection between the domestic and the international that I talked about. So the feminist foreign policy in Mexico actually creates a really good framework for the government, current government, civil society, and countries in the Latin American region to be reflective about those connections between the domestic and the international, the ecological disaster that we're all heading towards, and the ability to articulate that within the context of feminist foreign policy is also saying, look, for all of you countries out there, if you're going to deal with us, it is going to now be on those terms. And for that reason, I think it's very important. But I think it is too soon, not just because it's been 6 months, but because of the disruption that we've had with the pandemic. But it's certainly something that I've been very keen to follow, because I'm quite interested in global South representations of so-called feminist foreign policy. But I thought I would touch a bit on Errol's question, because I thought that was it's a really fascinating one, mainly because although I've never been thought to be very articulate to ask that question in that way, it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, right? This question of agency, because of the work that I do in Africa, it's probably something that's occupied my mind a lot in the last sort of 48 months. And I would say ideally, so the question was, is a non-sexist or anti-sexist foreign policy the same as a feminist foreign policy? And is feminist foreign policy defined mainly by its outputs, i.e. its objectives and aims, or is it about the extent to which women and girls' agency guides and represents the formulation of foreign policy? And I would suggest that when I think of feminist foreign policy, because I am of course thinking about women and girls, but I'm also thinking about the relationship between men and women, the relationship between the state and people who don't identify as either because they're non-binary, and also the relationship to things that are masculinized or feminized and not necessarily in particular bodies. And for that reason, I sort of think that the output and the input have to go together. Oftentimes, I do acknowledge that when a country designs its foreign policy, it's very much focused on, say, the civil society at best within its own country. You rarely find a situation where a country is going to sort of consult with civil society in the neighboring country to figure out how to write its own foreign policy. And for that reason, we might be constrained by the extent to which women and girls' agencies, particularly of those affected by the feminist foreign policy, can actually be included within feminist foreign policy. But I do think for that reason then, more and much more should be done with regards to the objectives and the aims. And I think sort of the definition that Bonnie read out, it's one with the Feminist Foreign Policy Project that I quite like. I guess the big thing, as I said earlier, the next step would be, because it's people focused, the extent to which that can then happen. But I'm very hopeful. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I also like to just say a bit about the excellent question about inputs and outputs. I mean, for me, foreign policy, feminist foreign policy it's a number of things. It's an approach, it's a way of thinking, it's a way of doing the actual discussion and deliberations. And I think what we would like it to eventually be is something that's subconscious, that's something that is automatically done. So that when you approach a certain issue, there are certain things that are highlighted. For example, feminist foreign policy highlights things like multilateralism, rule of law, bringing in the different voices. These are things that we believe, in addition to a number of other things. These are approaches, these are a way of thinking about issues, these are a way of understanding the way our policy should be discussed in the room, and in a sense also reflects what the outputs would be. And I think there are a lot of outputs that I see that do not reflect some of the inputs that we think we want to have in a feminist foreign policy. So you don't see, as much respect for rule of law. And here I'm talking about the U.S. So I don't want to say anything else, but you don't see as much of the focus on multilateralism, the focus on diplomacy, the focus on intersectionality, the representation of different voices, the anti-racist viewpoints, the things that we want to see, that when we see the outputs that don't reflect that helps us understand that the input is not right, that we don't have the kind of policy that we believe reflects the concepts of a feminist foreign policy. So it is both, for me, the more you have in the understanding the approach, you approach it that way, you think that way, when you do your policies, it's automatically the way you're thinking. That, in a sense, for me, will help ensure that the outputs are the ones that you want.
Thank you. Here also like a really super interesting question I like to ask you, Bonnie, especially because it might be related to your work in the network. So somebody has asked, how do you deal with actors who might use feminist foreign policy as a PR tool, and to what extent do you work, for example, with men on that topic, and how do you balance the risk of performative action and meaningful participation of men, of white men?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would like to say that this is an issue that cannot be done by any one group. This is something that we need to have. When we're talking about a feminist foreign policy, we're talking about one that encompasses everyone. And so it's not just women or white women or women of color or Black women, or, it's really a policy that reflects the way in which we do our foreign policy. It's the way in which we all work on it. So our goal would be to have a policy process that incorporates all these things, because there'll be a recognition that they're at the benefit for everyone, not just for women, but everybody will benefit from this. So it's not as if, if you have men promoting it, that somehow it means something negative for everyone. I mean, it's going to be beneficial for everyone. So we want everyone involved in understanding why it's important to have this kind of policy. And certainly there's always a question about whether somebody's real about it, if a group is real, if a person's real, if it's not just PR. That's something that kind of comes with the territory and understanding, that there may be some individuals or groups who think that it could be something that would really attract something that they want, and not that they're really interested in it. But for me, you know, it all comes out in the wash. You know, I mean, if somebody is really committed to it, commitment means there's some sustained action. You know, commitment means that you will see something different. And, you know, in given time, everything comes out, you know. And so if there's a real commitment, you'll see a change. If there's a real commitment, you will see signs of it. You will see those outputs. You will see something that reflects the fact that they really do believe in whatever it is that they're saying they believe in. If time goes by, you don't see change. They can't explain why there's no change. Then you can start to see that there was no reality behind it. They weren't real about it in the first place. So sometimes you may not know when they first start out. Sometimes you may want to take people at their face value because you want to give everybody a chance. You know, some you may already know they're just not being real just because you know who they are. But there may be some you want to give them a chance and give them a break, but time will tell. It all comes out in the wash.
That's definitely true. Yeah, it's simple, but it's true. Thank you so much, Bonnie. Here's also another question I like to address to both of you, Toni and Bonnie. Someone has asked, I think it was Anna, has asked how governments that are pursuing a feminist foreign policy kind of reproduce racist stereotypes through their programs they labeling under feminist foreign policy, and also how governments actually reproduce this narrative of white saviorism. So maybe you have one or two concrete examples. We can look at this dynamic, because I'm not sure whether all of the participants are aware of it and really know what it really means. Yeah.
Right. Okay. I mean, I think from my perspective, it's very, I know this sounds like a cop-out, but because off the top of my head, I can think of so many different examples of white saviorism that, you know, my usual answer to that is, oh my gosh, it's all so complex. But I'm sort of thinking about projects that I'm currently invested in. So because I'm looking at Africa and sort of militarization of police and interventions. Even though I never intended really to study France, France is very much on my radar, right? So I'll think about France, and in a way it's, you know, slightly unfair because it's the perfect example of this, but it's also a good illustration, right? So France has this very, very specific history in Francophone Africa, a history that is very problematic. That's not to suggest that it's any more problematic with certain US activities or British activities in Africa, but there is a very specific history. So all the things that we've said about racial hierarchies, colonialism, is very apt here, particularly in a place like France, where internally they've only really started to officially talk about race because people are French first more than anything else. And so you have this country that has adopted the Women, Peace and Security agenda, you know, has peace summits, a similarly progressive prime minister, adopts a French diplomatic policy. But then when I sort of look at its actual activities, both in the context of European engagement, but also bilaterally, and its articulated desire for peace, bringing peace to the region, particularly the Sahel, and the ways in which it does that do not necessarily go well with the kind of interventions that would promise feminist futures, shall we say. And I you know, I could, for anybody who wants to know, we can talk about that afterwards, but that would be the kind of example that I use, where I'm not necessarily sure that any of those activities are sort of deliberately being about white saviorism or deliberately being sexist or deliberately encouraging gender inequality, but that this idea that, you know, we have sort of the first responsibilities to save these people as we've been saving them for hundreds and hundreds of years, but not really. And the impact is very much felt by communities, by rural communities, not just people in the capital. So that would be kind of one example that I think of. But I can also think of a lot of other examples related to the UK where I'm at. I think it's not a story of just France in particular, but a story of hegemonic actors. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And you, Bonnie?
Well, I'm not exactly sure I understood the question. Is it really looking for examples where they do not necessarily follow feminist foreign policy? Is that the question exactly?
I think the question was about how actually actors and governments under the umbrella of feminist foreign policy still, although it should be anti-racist, they are still reproducing racist stereotypes and this construct of white saviorism.
Well, first of all, the U.S. has not adopted, as a government, has not adopted the feminist foreign policy. This is what a number of organizations have gotten together, and we launched the feminist foreign policy. So we're still trying to work out how we can have a government, how the government can adopt it. And there are a number of options that were set out in the paper. But what I can say, and I said a little bit about this already, is that there are many examples, I think, right now in the government, in the U.S. government, that do not necessarily follow the feminist foreign policy ideal. There's actions. I mean, some of the things that we put forth in the feminist foreign policy are things like dealing with substantive issues, like we have to deal with difficult issues that are impacting women around the world, everyone, but predominantly women around the world, but predominantly women of color. Issues like climate change, which the U.S. government, as you probably know, doesn't even want to put that in to any official documents. We're having challenges to reproductive health issues. So not only are there challenges on the concepts of feminist foreign policy, there's actually challenges on the actual issues themselves that fit within the ideals of a feminist foreign policy. One can also talk about, and I mentioned the idea of diplomacy and multilateralism, which are also under attack. So we have a challenge here in trying to, one, find ways to get it adopted and to pass the right processes for doing that, getting the concept themselves accepted, but also the actual issues that we highlight that are things feminist foreign policy we believe underscores are actually not being promoted. So we're even further back than some of the others on some of those respects.
Thank you. I think I would just, kind of ask also people here around whether they're still with us, whether they're enjoying the discussion. So I wanted to ask all of you if you could use your, there's like a button, it's called reactions, I guess, in English. I'm also just having it here in German. Whether you can use like one of the two options you have, so we all know you're still here with us and you like to hear more questions. Okay, I can see. Yeah, wow, okay, there are actually a lot of people here. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. Wow, yeah. So I would kind of make here like a cut and because I have one question especially being addressed to Kristina. And then afterwards we can continue with the round of questions, and also I still have some here. So Kristina, Jennifer has asked, since you as the CFFP are consulting for the German Foreign Ministry with regards to a feminist foreign policy, I was wondering how you address the issue that also Germany is a huge producer of weapons which, as Toni just mentioned, seems to jeopardize a feminist foreign policy agenda?
That is such an excellent question. And I guess it sounds like in the question that is referring to the fact that as part of CFFP, until earlier this year, I was a consultant and an advisor to the Foreign Ministry in Germany, which I'm not anymore, but we are doing several projects with and for the Auswärtiges Amt, the Foreign Ministry here in Berlin. We are not precisely consulting or working on them exactly on feminist foreign policy, because Germany at this point does not have a feminist foreign policy and is not proactively developing one. Though it is, I guess, it's fair to say that it's making important steps towards a at least gender interested, gender equal foreign policy, but not feminist in the sense as we're discussing here. So the question about arms exports is very important, because I guess many of you are aware, like the person who asked the question, that Germany is one of the top producers of arms globally. And in fact, the numbers about global militarization and arms exports that were published by CIPRI, the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research, in April this year showed that not only was last year, 2019, the year with the sharpest increase in international arms exports within a whole decade, but on top, Germany really led this development within Europe. So that is a very important question. So what we are doing in general, despite being a small organization, we are focusing a lot on the future of weapons, on like stopping killer robots, but also on the international arms trade, on nuclear policy, on export control. And to give one concrete example, currently we are doing a project with Greenpeace looking at German arms exports and the impact they have on different countries. So our approach really is, so of course we're working with like different ministries, and we're always there and happy to work with them and support where both parties believe it's beneficial. And at the same time, we take our role as activists, as people criticizing the current foreign policy system seriously, and trying to find ways how we can constructively criticize what's being done at the moment and show where problems are, so that ideally they will be fixed. Because when it comes to the arms export, for example, there's an international treaty, it's called the Arms Trade Treaty, and under this treaty, weapons should not be allowed to be delivered if, for example, there's a risk of gender-based violence. And many governments in this world, including Germany, say we do not have to assess this properly on top, because it's already covered by the human rights considerations. And we are saying to really implement this treaty and take kind of a feminist approach, at least within the current system, before we abolish it, ideally, to take it seriously, we need to change the practice. And so we're trying to find examples. We have like a different people working with us on the ground in the countries we're looking at. We're trying to show like this is happening. You cannot continue to say that we don't have to look at it. Yeah.
Thank you, Kristina. I think also Nina, who's also here on the call and also part of the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy team, would like to add something on that. Nina, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah,
hi, everyone.
Sorry for just hello.
I've been attentively listening, but actually I'm trying to finalize the report that Kristina just mentioned. So this is why I'm a bit in the background. But I just wanted to add something on the role of German arms exports in our work. And so we try to continuously address this issue also as part of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And we try to highlight that Germany cannot have women, peace and security as a focus area in the UN Security Council, but not address the arms export. And for example, I think in June, together with 16 other German NGOs, we published a report on women, peace and security, and how the third national action plan in Germany should look like, because Germany is currently developing its third national action plan, which will start in January 2021. And one of the recommendations from us is actually to work to a total stop of arms exports as part of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So we try to call out that it's not enough to just work on increasing the participation of women in the arms control processes or discussions and so on, but you actually need to change the policies.
Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tina, for your work and also for the comment. Just out of the nowhere, you popped up and delivered that statement. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I just would like to, I just want to add that I think it's that making that connection is so important about having 1325 and having the but at the same time the arms that you're selling, and yes, having women sitting there, but you're not. It's really having a comprehensive policy that they're being consistent, which is a problem for a lot of governments. So thanks for your work you're doing.
And is the as this is also like a session of self-reflection, and we want to learn and check our privileges, I also wanted to invite you all to a really, really quick check your privileges or check your surroundings round. So I was wondering, I'm going to ask a question, and I just, if you say yes, please stand up, or even just use the reaction button. How it depends what you want to do, and then also where you are. So I would like to ask all of you whether you consider yourself working in a feminist environment. So if it's a yes, please stand up or use the reaction button. So I stand up.
When you say the environment, you talk about an organizational environment?
Yeah,
or the
working.
Okay.
Yeah, working environment. Okay, so how many are really working in a feminist? Okay, there are some. This is good. And how many of you are working actually in a white-led organization or white-led working environment? Okay, this is a lot. Yeah. Okay, so we see this is definitely an issue, and I'm super happy that you all are joining the discussion and bringing the talking points and the aspects we are dealing with today to your working environment or your studying environment. So I'm looking at the time. We still have 20 minutes, so I will make a really short run of questions, because then we will head over to the final statements. What about the so what we have learned today, and what we can discuss maybe tomorrow with our colleagues in the office or via Zoom or with our friends. So here's a really interesting question from Metis, I think. I'm wondering why we only talk about a feminist foreign policy and not about feminist domestic policies. Because it seems to me that this could run the risk of reproducing the view that Western states don't need feminist policies that look at national issues, but only outward-facing feminist policies. So I think both of you have already mentioned a little bit of that in the beginning, but maybe you could briefly repeat or even get into more details why this is linked and why we are not only talking about foreign policy. Bonnie, you would like to start?
Sure, why not? Well, for me, there are a lot of things that we consider foreign policy that really have domestic impact. I see a lot of what we're talking about, because I mentioned, for example, the issue of climate change. That is both a foreign policy, but also clearly has domestic impact. What we do in a country has impact overseas, and what happens overseas has impact domestically. There is often a false distinction between things that are international and things that are domestic. And I think that's increasingly the case today. If we look at the type of threats that we're facing, so many of them which are environmental, because of climate change, for example, infectious disease, another example. So many of these issues are domestic and international. So I think, even though we talk foreign policy, there has to also be an underlying recognition that a lot of the issues that we're talking about do have domestic effect and domestic impact. When we talk about racism, when we talk about how foreign policy affects women of color around the world, these are domestic and international issues. When we talk about the way in which we approach issues, as I said, the mind that goes into the way in which we think about these issues. They are, yes, when we sit around the table, we talk about foreign policy issues, it's a foreign policy setting. But the way in which we need to talk about them is the same domestically. We should still be talking about how do we work together, diplomacy in a domestic setting, on domestic issues theoretically. So I think, we always have to think in terms of the fact that even though we say foreign policy, there's a lot of domestic impacts in what we do in foreign policy. And there's a lot of things that we do in the North that has obvious effects on the South. And we need to think about that in the way in which we approach our work. So that's what I'll say shortly about it. Thanks. And I will say we do a lot of thinking about that. We have something called Redefining National Security that we do in my organization. It's all about how we have to look at how we define our security how we define our security domestically is just as important as how we look at national security issues.
Thank you. Toni, what are your thoughts on that?
Great. I mean, from my perspective, I don't know who asked the question, but they're absolutely right. I mean, the reason, to my mind, that feminist foreign policy can be problematic in the ways that we've discussed is precisely because domestic policy is problematic. And in a way, countries are able to paper over the challenges within the domestic sphere by having a good foreign policy, whether it's feminist or not. Now, in the construction of feminist foreign policy, as I've understood it, so sort of thinking about the processes in Sweden, in Canada, I'm not familiar with France, but certainly Mexico as well. It's had to rely on domestic civil society organizations in constructing what is called feminist foreign policy or feminist international development assistance. And undoubtedly, a lot of the issues that they raise have to do with the domestic context, not just the international. So I think discussions about feminist foreign policy can certainly provide the space to have these kinds of conversations. So if you sort of think, for example, in Canada, in the last National Action Plan for WPS, there is an explicit acknowledgement of the kinds of injustices that First Nations women have faced, and forcing the government to sort of think about provisions, even though that's within, obviously, Canada itself. I mean, there are still issues with that, a lot of the racialized issues that we've talked about, but nevertheless, I think it was an important moment to sort of acknowledge the specific type of relationship that Canada had with these First Nations people. So I agree with Bonnie. It's a very false dichotomy to sort of think that there's a specific difference between well, I mean, there are differences, obviously, because there are always contextual differences in any policy area. But I think it's a false dichotomy to separate them. And as far as I know, most people who do foreign policy wouldn't, even those who don't do feminist foreign policy.
That's true. So before we close kind of the session with your final statements, Toni and Bonnie, I would like to invite Kristina to point out the so what a section of our discussion. So what can we take away also for our organization, which is dealing with feminist foreign policy, what we have learned from today. And before I hand over to Kristina, I'm not sure, I can't see her anymore, but I think she's still here, Toni and Bonnie, I would like you to think already about the final statement, answering the question. So when we, for example, we are going to meet like in 10 years from now and talking about the same issue, what could have been changed, or is it like still are we still facing the same challenges from today? So maybe you could include this into your final statement, and I hand over to Kristina.
Thank you. Yeah, indeed, I just dropped my Zoom, just stopped, but I'm back, thank God. Yeah, so what now? There is, I mean, there's lots to consider, and lots to do, and lots to unlearn. And I mean, being socialized in the society that we have been means that we grew up with kind of being indoctrinated with certain mindsets and ideas and ways of thinking, and it's an active process that we need to commit to unlearn all the ways of like discriminatory thinking and acting that I myself, that we as an organization also exhibit, and as was rightly pointed out by our speakers, by Bonnie and Toni, feminist foreign policy it's a big concept and idea that really needs to integrate all sorts of inequalities and the way that society's foreign policies have been built on racist ideas and the Peace of Westphalia and like the Western-centric view, and who's been like telling stories, and why is the concept of aid even a thing, and can we still keep it if we're doing feminist work? And it's really about rethinking all different aspects about how we're doing trade, and what about why are so many countries in the global south in debt, and how is it linked to colonialism, and why are most weapons produced in the north and being sold to the south, and what does it mean for conflicts and migration and climate policy, like who's producing the problem and who's mainly suffering. All these areas that I just mentioned within foreign policy and international politics, they're hugely influenced by racial inequalities and by an imbalance of power distributed in our world. So for us as an organization, I think it means to really invest in learning about all these structures, to then be able to identify them, and then be able to invest even more knowledge production and collaborating and organizing into coming up with new visions. And it's complex work, but it's important, and that's why we started this organization in the first place. And we're trying to do a good job, and often failing. Sometimes it works, and just trying to continue.
Yes, like you said, like it's complex, but it's also our responsibility to continue to learn and question our structures that we might have seen as standard or normal we're working in. Okay, so Toni and Bonnie, are you ready for your final statement? So I leave it up to you. Who would like to start? And then afterwards, as I already wrote into the chat, I also want to say thank you to all the participants. There were so many interesting questions. I'm sorry we couldn't ask all of them, but we really want to make sure that we will kind of can address them in our policy brief we will publish. So Toni and Bonnie, you have the floor.
I can go first. So I felt bad because we weren't able to get to a lot of really interesting questions and discussions, and I thought, okay, I can use this to sort of wrap up. So some of the themes that came up was around inclusion, who gets to sort of speak in the domain of feminist foreign policy, given the fact that we've identified that it is quite white and it still very much favors already dominant groups. I think that the answer to that is really to the people who already occupy those spaces, but also that there has to be a willingness to go outside perhaps our comfort zones. So, you know, speaking for myself, I'm an academic. Most of the time I am speaking to academics. I am probably getting out of my comfort zone a bit because of discussions and engagements around the women, peace and security agenda. But beyond that, I'm most comfortable hanging out with my students mainly. But I think that the only way forward to the kind of people-centered ideas about foreign policy is by those people who already have spaces within institutions to create space for other people who might not already be included. And I think that it's the only way to change mindsets. And this sort of brings me to the question that Megan had about Northern Ireland specifically. I've often been quite fascinated living in the UK, the differences in the ways that the UK and Ireland think about women, peace and security and the idea of post-conflict space. So both Ireland and the UK are invested in post-conflict settings, in supporting women's rights in post-conflict settings. But interestingly enough, part of the reason that Ireland, Republic of Ireland is interested in that is because it considers itself a post-conflict society because of Northern Ireland. But the United Kingdom does not consider itself a post-conflict society. And so a lot of its engagements with WPS, and I think therefore its possibilities for feminist foreign policy are very externalized and then justify some of the more problematic policies domestically in GB, but also related to the United Kingdom as a whole. I think that 2020 has been an eye-opener. So, I remember last year that some not so great things happened, but this year has so far eclipsed it so much that I barely remember anything from 2019. But one thing that has stayed with us, that has been here, is sort of this rise of what some would call the right-wing populism. But I'm not necessarily sure that it's the populism part that is the problem. But we certainly have movements that are anti-feminist, racist, and quite resistant. And I don't think that that's going to go anywhere soon. But at the same time, these people, just as we are, cannot ignore the fact that in the context of COVID specifically, you have all these news articles that somehow are very invested in asking, why aren't Africans basically dying, right? Africa, the one country of Africa, why is COVID not affecting them so much? And we can't unsee that. We can't unsee the ways in which these questions are being asked, the way in which it's been framed, because at the same time, when we look within our own countries in the global north, we have to ask the question, why is it that minoritized people are dying at the rate at which they are? So although there is this backlash and there is this anti-sentiment, I think that things are so far in the open that links the domestic to the international that we can no longer put it back in a box. And that's where I have the hope. I'm not necessarily sure that I have the answers as to how you enact that in policy terms, but I think that there's certainly a space for further conversation about how you take that forward. Thank you.
And Toni, your thoughts on 2030 on feminist foreign policy?
In 2030, well, I think certainly, maybe this goes back to Kate's earlier question about branding. I think we will probably see more countries take on that feminist foreign policy. I think they might use it as a branding exercise to start with, but I also know that because they will be obliged to engage with communities, civil society organizations, they will be challenged on what that means. we're not very far from 2030. Perhaps the older I get, the faster time goes. So I don't think that 2030 is that far away. 2030 tends to be this weird date. We have it in development as well. I don't think that the world would have changed significantly by then. So that's my pessimistic thing of the day. But there will certainly be more countries that are leaning into feminist foreign policy, and therefore there will be more opportunities to challenge our governments to act in a way that is transformative for foreign policy practices.
Thank you. And Bonnie?
Yes, I'll be brief. And first of all, I just want to thank Kristina, Nina, Miriam for being a wonderful moderator. And also Toni for sharing, can't say the stage, I guess say the screen with me on this. I really appreciate it. This has been a great discussion. It's wonderful to hear from all of you who are working on these issues about the different perspectives that everyone has on feminist foreign policy and the way in which it's being implemented more or less in different countries and some of the challenges, and also the need to make sure that there is more diversity in the actual discussions and themselves. For me, you know, feminist foreign policy, you know, encompasses things like the ideas in which we bring these ideas forward, the policy forward, the processes in which we can make it happen and convince governments to actually adopt them and implement them. The substance, which are the actual, some of the actual issues, in addition to the concepts of feminist foreign policy, but what we're actually trying to make a change in, which are the actions themselves, as I said, and also allyship, you know, working with everyone on this issue, men and women and others alike on this. And of course, the endurance and perseverance to make this work, because it's not going to be obviously something that's adopted easy, or once adopted, or becomes a government policy that is actually implemented in the way it should be. There are many things that we need to do. We have a long way to go in order to really see feminist foreign policy a part of the policy of a particular government, and having more governments actually look into this and adopt it. But I do feel some inspiration in terms of the change and the effort by those to make change and to seek change, and what we are seeing in 2020, which we have to continue and we have to sustain into the future. For me, 2030, you know, it'd be nice if there was actually not even a reason to say feminist foreign policy, that is our policy. And our policy does encompass the ideas and the processes and the actions and the input and the output that we want to see reflected in all of the definitions of foreign policy, feminist foreign policy that are existing right now and will in the future. So for me, a success is not to even have it just say, this is our policy, and it encompasses what's in them. I guess before I leave, I should, and I haven't, and I want to thank Miriam for raising this when you started, the work that my organization is doing with the Organizations and Solidarity Statement, which is trying to get organizations to sign up to the 12 commitments to make change on racism and discrimination, and encompasses so many of the ideals that we seek in feminist foreign policy. So, you know, that, you know, information, of course, is on the website, but I do want to at least mention that because I really forgot to say anything about that during the discussion. But thank you again, everyone, for this. This has been great. I always learn from these type of experiences, you know, and find ways in which what all of you are doing is inspiring for me and keeps me going. So thanks again for hosting this, and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much. And I would love to close the session with the statement you said before, Bonnie. So there is no commitment without sustainable action. I really love that, and I think this is really something we should repeat and promote people if they talk about their working on feminist foreign policy, because yeah, like you said, by the end of the day, we see who is really committed and who is really willing, to work on that. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining. I wish you a wonderful evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are. And yeah, stay tuned and keep up the discussion. And we are really looking forward, to hearing from you all and pursuing a feminist foreign policy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.